From the Netherlands, this is the Green Planet Monitor, voices and stories from a warm, wet planet. Today, long COVID, a complex ailment driving lots of people down.
It is very complicated. No long COVID patients are similar. Somebody may have complete brain fog and possibly migraine. Cannot focus, cannot concentrate. Mental fatigue, taking care of 4 kids but cannot work anymore. That is one phenotype. The other suddenly spikes up antithyroid peroxidase antibodies and gets a full-blown Hashimoto's thyroiditis.
Moms, babies, and bacteria. The relationship starts before you're born, then you're colonized.
Babies exposed to all the vaginal bacteria. The vagina and anus are really close together, so they're exposed to kind of intestinal bacteria as well. And then that is the very initial bacteria that get into the baby's mouth and then start to build the microbiome in the baby's intestine.
And Canadian forests, they're not a carbon sink.
Forests in Canada are being clear-cut at a very alarming rate. This wood is being taken and being turned into single-use products that we use once and flush or throw away, or that we send to the incinerator and burn for energy, and it's gone in just a couple of minutes. None of these products store carbon for the long term. So this sense that, we're, sort of cutting down the trees to keep the carbon locked up and then planting more so that it can absorb even more carbon is really a myth.
This is the Green Planet Monitor. I'm David Kattenberg. Before launching in, a request. Help us deliver this weekly package of Earth news. Subscribe and or donate at greenplanetmonitor.net. Back in early May, the World Health Organization announced that the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic no longer constitutes a public health emergency of international concern. Since it was first reported in China in December 2019, the RNA virus has infected over 767 million people around the world and killed almost 7 million. As the pandemic fades, its long-term aftermath continues to build in the form of so-called long COVID. The WHO defines post-COVID-19 condition as the, quote, continuation or development of new symptoms 3 months after the initial SARS-CoV-2 infection, with these symptoms lasting for at least 2 months with no other explanation, unquote. Common long-haul COVID symptoms include fatigue, shortness of breath, and cognitive dysfunction. Many other symptoms have been reported. According to the WHO, between 10 and 20% of those infected by COVID have or will go long-haul. According to Health Canada, about 15% of the 4.7 million Canadians who came down with COVID have suffered symptoms for 3 or more months following their initial infection. Almost half have had symptoms for a year or longer. One of these long-haul COVID sufferers is Manali Mukherjee, an assistant professor of medicine at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. Mukherjee and her colleagues are now working with a cohort of 120 long COVID patients, trying to tease out what's causing their prolonged symptoms. So you're suffering from long COVID. What's it like?
It's not nice. It's not something that you can put a tab on. It's very vague. You have a lot of fatigue. Suddenly you don't know where it's coming from. You get sudden headaches. I think my symptoms were much more less pronounced than most of the patients that I'm seeing these days. They are much, much more severe. I think I had the lesser brunt of it. But if I did have a lesser brunt of it, it did affect my quality of life, my concentration, my focus, my work output tremendously. There were relapses. Sometimes you would feel like you're getting better, and then it relapses back, and then suddenly there is like 2 weeks that you are absolutely, devoid of energy, fatigue, lots of headache, and you're like, oh, again. And all you can do at that time is pace out. You just have to pace out. I had symptoms that were pretty much pronounced for 18 months, which included also loss of taste and smell, brain fog.
What's the association, if any, has been seen between being vaccinated or not being vaccinated and coming down with long COVID?
I like the term that you used, association. Yes, that's all that is there. There is a lot of association data out there, so causal, not causal. We also have to think about it that when the vaccines rolled out, the variants started differing. During the Delta wave, the Delta variant was much more potent, like more virulent. People had more symptoms compared to the Omicron, where the transmissibility was higher, more people got infected, but the severity of symptoms were lower. There has been a lot of speculation about whether the symptoms during the acute phase were related to the amount of post-COVID symptoms that you would get and therefore the development of long COVID. The truth is there seems to be no correlation so far when it comes to the variants. Now, with the variants comes in the vaccination status. So some people were vaccinated, one time vaccinated, and then they got COVID, or twice vaccinated, then they got COVID, or somebody who had COVID before got vaccinated, got reinfected. I'm one of them. So right now, one of the data set that I have seen, and that is published, they are saying that there is a 60% lower chances of having long COVID if you have been vaccinated at least once. Is that something that I see in my study? I do see a lot of patients who have long COVID symptoms or who ended up getting a medical diagnosis despite being vaccinated when they had COVID. But if we take mean numbers, like we take a lot of people who did not get vaccinated versus those who got vaccinated, and I put those mean numbers together and not in-person personalized data, then there is a significant decrease in some of the inflammatory markers in the blood. For example, TNF-alpha with like pro-inflammatory cytokines, which again makes sense because when they had the acute phase infection, if they had the vaccine, the amount of pro-inflammatory cytokines that were there to start with was possibly lower.
You were talking about cytokines. Cytokines are these chemical mediators of inflammation.
Yes.
We talk about cytokine storms and things like that.
Yes. So the four potent ones that you always look out for is IL-1 beta, IL-8, IL-6, and TNF-alpha. So I always look that in our patients. Problem is we have not caught them during the acute phase. So in the imperfect world, in utopian world, which I would have liked doing science, which never happens, is that you catch the people before they get the disease, you catch them during disease, and then you catch them during recovery and post, right? That would be the perfect longitudinal to really understand the course of the disease itself, how it modulates your immune system, and thereafter how the recovery affects or does not affect, right? But here we are handicapped by the fact that we do not have any pre-pandemic values. Right? We do not have any pre-pandemic blood. The people who started working with long COVID do not usually have recourse to the acute phase blood. So I can only speculate. What I do have is a very well characterized post-COVID, long COVID cohort. So when it's very well characterized and we have all the clinical data at the time being, and we're looking post 6 months, post 12 months, at least that's the best that we can do with the situation at hand. It seems like the pro-inflammatory cytokines are lower in those who were vaccinated, but the patient-reported outcomes do not differ.
Oh, it's complicated.
It is very complicated. And not to mention the heterogeneity. No long COVID patients are similar. I can tell you that. So so somebody may have complete neurocognitive symptoms, does not have dyspnea, does not have any, hair fall, or does not have any inflammatory issues, no rashes, nothing, no fatigue, only neurocognitive. So complete brain fog and possibly migraine that has come out of nowhere. Cannot focus, cannot concentrate. Mental fatigue, not physical fatigue. It's taking care of 4 kids, but cannot work anymore. That is one phenotype. The other suddenly spikes up antithyroid peroxidase antibodies and gets a full-blown Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Or a 55-year-old man gets lupus.
A full-blown what?
Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So it's an autoimmune thyroiditis. So it's an autoimmune. So somebody who was previously healthy or did not require to go to a rheumatologist for any symptoms, after COVID starts getting all these symptoms and has a full-blown thyroid problem, which is the background is because of an autoantibody or a rogue antibody that was created, that was generated in the body. So these are all causal. Have I been able to prove that this has happened because of long COVID? No. I can only see a causal prevalence. But somebody may just be fine. Somebody who had a lot of symptoms at 8 months, we are seeing them after 6 months. They are saying, oh, I'm really better now.
It's interesting that the epidemiology seems to show that older people who came down with COVID tended to be amongst those who were had the most severe cases and often had to get hospitalized, whereas younger people tended to be less likely to come down with severe acute COVID. But on the other hand, it's the younger people aged 25 to 55, and particularly women, coming down with long COVID. Mm-hmm. So what's going on here?
There can be immunological explanation to this. There can also be a very simple socioeconomic explanation to this. Okay, the younger ones, the ones who are they're in the working population, women especially, mostly they're high functioning women. They take care of kids, they're going to the office, they're taking care of household thing. Can they really take the time after an infection to take off for a week, 2 weeks? They don't. So they're exerting their bodies after an infection, and they're possibly not coming down to homeostasis in time, and they are getting more and more fatigued. The only way that, the most common thing that I'm hearing right now that is helping, and that helped me as well, is pacing down. When do we ever pace down? So I think that is a simple socioeconomic thing that I'm talking about, like the general, how women are versus men. And also, see, if my husband really not well, I will fuss over him. As for me, younger people, or even younger men for that matter, they'll pop a Tylenol and go to work. It's something that's just going to go. Right? But we will take care of our parents if they're not well. I think that kind of psychology comes in. If I think about it from an immunology point of view of it, or the endocrine system, men and women have different hormonal system. We know that women are more prone to autoimmune diseases, so there might be immunological underpinnings that needs to be looked at. That's the reason why having sex as a biological variable in study designs is so important. And I think long COVID just opened our eyes. There are more women who are reporting, that's for sure.
So there are these two competing theories, and in all cases, it's never one or the other. Is long COVID associated with persistent low-level infection? Are there still viruses there that are causing the long COVID that are kind of creeping out now and then? Or are they all gone, but it's as you say, an autoimmune disease?
So if there are virus particles in the body in a low bit, wouldn't that keep on causing the inflammation? And if there is an autoimmune that has been triggered, would it not lead to the symptoms? I think it can be both, or it could be a loop, a vicious cycle, or it might be different for different people. So it has not yet been teased out. So I have seen data from my colleagues where they have been able to detect virus particles within the immune cells.
In people with long COVID?
Yeah, but it's not peer reviewed. It's not yet published. So these are very very nascent stage studies. So there is a possibility, there's speculation. If it is there, then it will keep a low-grade inflammation on. Is that low-grade inflammation enough to cause this kind of debilitating issues, leading to a diagnosis of an autoimmune disease? I would say no. But if the body has not been able to handle the inflammatory cascade and keeps on into a hyperinflammatory mode, then it will lead to disease diagnosis. Those people may not even have any of those viral reservoirs anywhere in their body. So the point is to tease out, does it stay, does it not? The biggest problem with the research that's going on right now is nobody is maintaining the time from recovery. I think it's very important.
When you look in the blood of people with long COVID, do you find these rogue antibodies? Do you find these various types of cytokines floating around?
Yes. And it is very time dependent, which means if I look at somebody who is 3 or 6 months post-infection, they may have higher levels. They come back in 12 months or 18 months, it's gone. They're back to normal.
Higher levels of what?
Cytokines or autoantibodies. Not everybody has it. I'm talking about only certain people. I have been able to find a casual or an association between those who have these rogue antibodies and those who are reporting symptoms of dyspnea, which is shortness of breath, and fatigue. And when these titers go down, their symptom reporting is also going down. Since then, what we have found out is in enriched population, as in those who are reporting long COVID, those who are absolutely long COVID patients, they have those rogue antibodies very much visible in their circulation. They do have reporting of symptoms, but all said and done, does not mean that just because you have those autoantibody, you will keep having those autoantibodies, or just because your cytokines are increased, you will keep having them increase. You will attenuate or you will stay on. That is what is required to be understood right now. Who attenuates with time and who leads to a diagnosis, or who just remains status quo and keeps having long COVID symptoms, which still does not have a specific diagnosis that you can give them a medical intervention, but they just have to grit their teeth and go along with it. So it's all a time game. I think it's very important to understand where you are on this timeline. There's no point getting anxious at 6 months if you have a high pro-inflammatory cytokine level and you're having symptoms. The possibility is by 12 months you will get better, or by 18 months you will get better, like I did. Okay, but I also know so many people did not. And I also know so many people at 20 months or post ends up getting, needs to be seen by a medical, by a physician, or is requiring daily physiotherapy, or has to take off work.
I gather that it's difficult putting together control groups. I mean, every experimental study, you got to have the experimental group and the control group. And it's difficult coming up with control groups. Can you explain this?
Yeah. So in the perfect world, the control group would be at the same time that you are picking up these patients when they had their infections. You get people who had symptoms but did not have infections. So basically did not have COVID. Like, it's difficult to find people who have not had COVID. They are the precious few. If I were Golem, I will hold them dear and say, my precious, And there are only few biobanks who will have that kind of samples, but they will not have the clinical data that is required. So I have 120 long COVID patients in my cohort who are very well characterized, seen by a rheumatologist. I've done all their molecular markers. So to compare them, I am at the moment getting people who have had COVID but have not had the symptoms. So they are my no long COVID cohort, which I think is very important to see what's the difference. And the other, and I'm really striving for it, is somebody who, to the best of their knowledge, did not get COVID.
And this is the amazing thing, that people who, to the best of their knowledge, didn't come down with COVID.
Yeah, I mean, I have been able to get maybe 15 so far. It's so difficult. But for long COVID, I had like 500 referrals in a year.
How do you find these people?
They reach out. I think people are desperate to get an answer. I mean, I'm an immunologist. I'm trained. I possibly understood what was going on with me. And still, the kind of symptoms and the repetition of it was making me anxious, was frustrating me. So can you imagine people out there who are not trained, who do not have answers, and you have conspiracy theories floating everywhere around, how messed up they get when they see they are suffering, or their children are suffering, or their mother is suffering, and new symptoms popping up which was never there.
Are these sorts of symptoms, is long COVID unique? I mean, unique is a dangerous word to use, but is SARS-CoV-19 kind of different from other viral infections that we know of in terms of long-term effects?
So, David, I'm not a virologist. I'm an immunologist. So, as I understand, having immunological dysfunction or a dysregulation in your immune system, it is common after an infection, especially after virus infections. Viruses are notorious for triggering autoimmune responses and post-viral syndromes. So having a post-viral issue after SARS-CoV-2 infection is not surprising to somebody like me. The reason why this has taken with a storm is because of the sheer numbers and the magnitude of people who have been affected. You see, when the pandemic started and the whole storm just hit us, physicians and the medical community were just too keen and too involved with just keeping people out of the hospital or to save people, those who are in the ICU, because, the death rates were so high. So the ones who were surviving, we were not paying attention to them because they have survived. Our point is to make sure people survive. So once those who were surviving slowly started reporting symptoms, I think until 2021 March or even mid-summer, long COVID was still a myth, right? It's only when patient groups and patient advocates started coming together, more and more similar reports, started being aired out, social media. That's when people started realizing, holy cow, there is a post-viral condition that is pretty much apparent with this infection, and how severe it is something that needs to be done. And finally, it came to the point that really there's more people than we thought it would be because of the numbers, and it's going to affect healthcare. And the symptoms are so heterogeneous that it started gaining the attention of policymakers, medical community, government. And now there is a proper wheel in position that is looking into it. So we have a pan-Canadian long COVID consortium that it's called the Long COVID Web, which consists of patient advocates, health policy outcome, scientists, physicians, physiotherapists, all these people who have come together to try and understand it with their expertise, but with a common vision. So things are getting recognized because the numbers are so huge. Is post-viral syndrome absolute, oh my God, took us by surprise? The answer is no. Viruses do that.
If long COVID is an autoimmune disease associated with rogue antibodies and cytokines, one would think that there must be simple ways or straightforward ways to treat it or to reduce the symptoms. Are there?
It's very difficult to treat autoimmune diseases. The most common treatment therapy is corticosteroids or anti-inflammatory immune suppression regimes like methotrexate and azathioprine, and further on you move on depending on which autoimmune disease. If it is vasculitis, you possibly would go for rituximab, which is an anti-B cell depletion therapy. And all these immune suppression therapies, they come with their own plague of adverse outcomes.
These are drugs with lots of side effects.
Correct. I think sometimes it's a basic philosophy of life: wait and watch and unfurl. Study it and let it unfurl. People who need immediate medical attention, let's give them the immediate medical attention. And as for the rest, instead of rolling out therapeutic, this is what's going to stop you from having long COVID, I think without having a proper understanding of what it can do, I think it's unethical and not so prudent. So right now, the way we are doing it is, if we see this patient requires medical attention, we figure out what is their main symptom. So if their main symptom is cardiology, right, we'll send them to a cardiologist. If their main system is rheumatology, and we know that there is an autoimmune disease coming up, or they have the antibodies, we send them to a rheumatologist. So let them treat the disease as they would treat according to their discretion of their patient population. So I think that's the best way.
Manali Mukherjee, based on your own experience with long COVID patients, what's your message to those patients? Would you say to them that there is light at the end of the tunnel? There's probably light.
Absolutely. There is always light at the end of the tunnel. It's nice and bright. Point is that diseases come. We're all getting older. We would never, if I expect that I will be at my health status that I was at when I was 34, and then now, I think I am doing myself a disfavor. We will all want to be in the best of health. The truth is, health does break down. The best way is to be kind to yourself, to be less anxious, to listen to your body. If it wants rest, give it the rest that it needs. And if you think that even after pacing out, your quality of life is getting affected, your amount of work output, or it's bothering you, then please do go see a physician. As simple as that. But please don't go for these tests that are coming out saying, oh, this is what's going to diagnose long COVID. my suggestion is just go to a physician, tell them your worry, or reach out to people like us who are doing studies. There are so many centers that are studying long COVID patients. You will possibly get answers there, or you might be able to get referred to a physician because we will be able to figure out that you do need medical attention. So we will be able to refer you to a physician. So I think be kind to yourself and don't get so anxious. There's a lot of people who are suffering and a lot of people who are recovering.
Manali Mukherjee is an assistant professor of medicine at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. Listen to our complete interview and read more about long COVID at greenplanetmonitor.net. You are listening to the Green Planet Monitor. If you're appreciating what you're hearing, go to greenplanetmonitor.net and subscribe or donate or both. With your generous help, we'll keep delivering stories about global ecology, human development, justice, and science to listen to, read, and watch. It's one of the greatest episodes in a human being's life, getting primed and colonized by bacteria. Inside mom, a developing fetus is supposed to be sterile. The instant it emerges, microbes move in, as vital to a growing infant and child as that little kid is to them, a lifetime bond that sometimes goes sideways, though usually not, and spans generations. Here's a story about that. We've all gone through the same routine, having spent 9 months in that warm, wet space, just us, totally sterile. We emerge into a world packed with microbes, longing to colonize us. 3 out of 4 Canadians get colonized as they squeeze down mom's birth canal. Melanie Conrad studies that incredible event at Charité Hospital in Berlin, Germany.
When the delivery process occurs, the baby is exposed to all the vaginal bacteria, all the perineal bacteria. So there's obviously the vagina and anus are really close together. So they're exposed to kind of intestinal bacteria as well. And then that is the very initial bacteria that get into the baby's mouth and then start to build the microbiome in the baby's intestine.
Those bacteria may be pioneers, but the infant gut they're colonizing has been primed by microbes in the gut of the kid's mother. Mom's gut microbes make her gut walls more permeable to essential nutrients. Among these, short-chain fatty acids that head straight for the developing fetus. Kate Kennedy studies the process at McMaster University.
One of the key groups of metabolites are those short-chain fatty acids, and we know those can cross the placenta. They can also bind to receptors on the placenta. They can influence placental development itself. But we know how important short-chain fatty acids are in a non-pregnant gut to shaping gut function, and those also cross over and we think shape fetal gut development.
Now, 1/3 of Canadians get born by C-section. They get colonized too, just by breathing air and coming close to mom. Their poops are definitely different. Deborah Money is a professor of gynecology and obstetrics at the University of British Columbia.
There is a difference in vaginally born infants and cesarean-born infants' stool makeup. The microbiome of the infant stool is somewhat different, but our study would actually suggest it's maybe more influenced by the antibiotics that are associated with cesarean births rather than the process of birthing itself.
The impact of antibiotics on newborn gut microbiomes has been the subject of debate. Deborah Money.
We established routine use of antibiotics for all the right reasons to prevent post-delivery infections in the mom, and in some cases to prevent infections in the newborn. But we probably didn't appreciate its influence on the infant gut microbiome as much as it seems to have.
Antibiotics are also administered prior to vaginal birth to women with high numbers of a certain vaginal bacterium, group B streptococcus. Kate Kennedy.
In 99% of cases where a woman is colonized with group B strep, her baby isn't going to have any negative consequences. So we're using antibiotics in all of those women during delivery to prevent a disease that is quite rare. And if there is another way that we can understand the relationships between us and our microbes and the microbes and each other and prevent that transmission of a potentially dangerous microbe to the babies without or by reducing the use of antibiotics, that would be beneficial not only for antimicrobial resistance, but also by preventing that early life exposure to antibiotics, which can then change that early colonization of the babies.
Antibiotics definitely dampen the newborn microbiome. They may also predispose newborns to allergies down the road. On the other hand, breast is definitely best. Deborah Sloboda studies maternal and infant microbiomes at McMaster University.
Breastfeeding. Breastfeeding is the second wave of immune priming and learning and activation, right? Because a lot of antibodies pass through breast milk, as well as this sharing of microbes between the infant and the mother. Skin microbes, gut microbes, passing back and forth between infant and mom in breast milk. So all of that to actually fuel immune development and how well that baby is going to respond to the postnatal environment. And remember, the postnatal environment is full of microbes.
How best to prepare baby for a world full of microbes, outside and inside, continues to fascinate researchers. There's more to the mystery. Analysis of all the bacterial DNA in a person's gut, metagenomics, reveals that each person's gut microbiome is unique and inherited. Jeroen Ras studies gut bugs metagenomically at the University of Leuven in Belgium.
We actually find that people have their own distinct strains that other people don't have. Or at least everybody has their own signature of specific strains. And those specific strains of bacteria, they're transmitted from mother to child.
And from a grown woman to her children.
We did find evidence for bacteria that were transmitted across multiple generations, where we found the same bug living in the great-grandmother, and we found it back in the great-grandchild.
Unlike our own DNA, our microbial inheritance isn't carved in stone. It shifts this way and that, and can be nurtured. For more information about the maternal-infant bacterial bond, go to greenplanetmonitor.net. While you're there, subscribe. For $5 or more, you'll be helping to make this news package happen. You are listening to the Green Planet Monitor. I'm David Kattenberg. Forests store carbon. Walk through a dense one, you'd be forgiven for thinking most of that carbon is stored in big tree trunks, branches, and leaves. In fact, in the northern hemisphere, most forest carbon ends up below ground, in root structure, particularly in fine roots, and in slowly decomposing soil, nowhere more so than in Earth's vast boreal region across northern Canada, Scandinavia, and Russia. Colossal volumes of carbon are stored in soil, boggy sediments, and peat. As Earth's climate warms, though, forests are drying and burning. They and their underlying soils are releasing vast quantities of CO2. According to a recent report in the journal Science, CO2 emissions from boreal fires have doubled in recent years. Insect infestations tied to climate warming are weakening forests, amplifying emissions. Then there's clear cutting, a big industry all around the world. Wherever forests have been slashed, Their soils release carbon at an accelerated rate. Tree planting, much touted by governments and industry, doesn't seem to compensate. In Canada, the Federal Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development is less than impressed. Canada's 2 billion trees program will only reach 2% of its goal, says Commissioner Jerry DeMarco. Ottawa hasn't struck long-term deals with provinces and territories to meet program objectives, DeMarco says, and it hasn't been upfront about how it monitors planted trees to see if they're actually growing. Worse still, government reporting on logging emissions was inconsistent, the commissioner says. Inconsistent may be an understatement. According to a pair of independent policy analysts, quote, Ottawa is effectively erasing logging's emissions from its ledger book, unquote. Canada's logging industry generates 11% of national greenhouse gas emissions, the analysts say, more than Canada's electricity sector and just a bit less than its notorious oil sands. Michael Polanyi is policy and campaign manager for nature-based climate solutions at Nature Canada. Jennifer Skeen is the Natural Climate Solutions Policy Manager for the Natural Resources Defence Council's Canada program. Can you explain these numbers? Like, I thought that forestry operations and replanting, that Canadian forests were supposed to be absorbing carbon dioxide. What you're saying is that forestry operations are actually leading to a net release of 73 megatons of carbon in 2021, 11% of Canada's total. Can you explain these numbers?
Sure. Yeah. So it was, as you mentioned, a very startling finding, although I think there have been questions raised about Canada's forest carbon accounting for a while now. And when we looked into the actual national inventory, which is Canada's annual reporting of greenhouse gas emissions, we looked at Canada's own data. And what we did was we looked at those emissions that can be reasonably attributable to industrial logging, so to the practice of cutting down and removing trees, and then the inevitable release either in the near term or in the long term of the carbon from that wood. And what we found looking at the carbon that is taken out of the forest from harvesting, even accounting for the carbon that is stored for a period of time in long-lived wood products, because some of that is locked up for a period of time from the atmosphere, and even accounting for the replanting of trees following harvesting. Canada's industrial logging sector, as you note, is a very significant emitter of greenhouse gases on the order of 73 plus megatons a year.
And by comparison, you're saying that the electricity generation sector in 2021 was responsible for 52 megatons. So logging is responsible for 73 million. And the oil sands operations are responsible for 85 megatons in 2021, and just a little bit more than what industrial logging is responsible for.
Right. So logging is right up there with all of these other sectors that are in the inventory and accounted for, and yet it's been, as we wrote, kept off the ledger books and largely ignored. Including this applies, of course, in Canada's inventory, but it has also been applied to how Canada approaches its policymaking and its emissions reduction plan for addressing climate change by 2030, and basically how it regards forests across all of its policymaking. As you mentioned at the beginning, most people, including the government, sort of represents the way that they're handling their forests as net carbon neutral. And that is not, of course, the case.
Michael, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Jennifer spelled it out fairly well. It is a surprising finding for Canadians who are used to thinking of oil and gas, transportation, maybe energy production as being the big emitting sectors in Canada. And, Canada does recognize that there are significant emissions associated with the removal of vast amounts of carbon and either the burning or turning that carbon into short-lived paper products and even longer-lived wood products. That they recognize that in the inventory. The problem is they take credit for a massive carbon sink associated with forests that have never been logged or never been replanted. They take that massive carbon sink and, in effect, give credit to the industry for the work that Mother Nature is doing, sequestering carbon. And then at the end of the day, they say, well, yeah, harvested wood and emissions from forest land together kind of come out in the wash. And that really creates the false impression of an industry that is carbon neutral when in fact it is one of the high emitting sectors in Canada.
And each year, Canada's logging industry clear cuts more than 550,000 hectares of forests. When you clear cut a forest, what's the fate of the carbon in that wood? And what happens to the carbon that's stored in the soil? Because most carbon in forests is stored in the soil. It's below ground, not above ground. What happens to the carbon below ground after the carbon above ground has been clear cut? And what's the fate of the carbon in the timber that comes out?
So, one of the most pervasive myths is that the vast majority of all this wood is sort of going into these long-lived products like, our tables and our chairs and our grandmother's armoire that gets stored there for, hundreds, 100 plus years. And that's simply not the case. Some of the wood is going to longer-lived uses. But actually, the majority of it is going to egregiously short-lived end uses like toilet paper, paper towels, and biomass. So the forests in Canada are being clear-cut, as you mentioned, at a very alarming rate with devastating consequences. And this is not just for the climate, but also, as you note, for biodiversity and the ecosystem as a whole. And then this wood is being taken and basically being turned into single-use products that we use once and flush or throw away, or that we send to the incinerator and burn for energy, and it's gone in just a couple of minutes. And of course, none of these products store carbon for the long term. So this sense that, we're, sort of cutting down the trees to keep the carbon locked up and then planting more so that it can absorb even more carbon is really a myth. And in terms of what's actually happening on the ground in the forest, the dynamics are complicated. As you note, the vast majority of the boreal's carbon is locked up in its soils. So, about 15 to 20% of it is in the trees. And of course, that gets then sort of taken off site and eventually emitted either in the near term or the long term. And then, yes, the ecosystem on the ground, the carbon that had been previously locked up in that soil, a lot of it is, released to the atmosphere. That forest had been sort of a perpetual, in many cases, carbon storehouse. And actually, Canada's boreal forest is the largest terrestrial carbon storehouse in the world. It holds twice as much carbon as the world's oil reserves, and actually twice as much carbon per acre as the Amazon. So we think of the Amazon as, the lungs of the earth and really vital to climate change. And of course it is, but the boreal and the forests in Canada are right up there with this forest in terms of its importance to the climate and to future generations.
And most of that carbon, again, is in the soil. Think of the boreal forest. There are all those, spindly little trees. There's way more carbon stored below ground in root structure and in decomposed carbon. What happens to that carbon that's in the ground after it's been clear cut or burned?
Right. So when the forest is clear cut, this is not something that just happens on the surface. If you go to a clear cut, you see the soil, it's been sort of all churned up. There's a lot of disturbance to the ecosystem, and the carbon dynamics that had been ongoing there for decades or more are disrupted. And so a lot of the carbon from that soil is released into the atmosphere. Of course, exacerbating climate change every bit as much as emissions from smokestacks and tailpipes. And this carbon is emitted for 10 plus years. This isn't something where the logging industry comes in, they clear cut the forest and, suddenly it starts regrowing and sequestering carbon. It takes a very long time for that forest to start sequestering carbon. It in fact emits carbon for 10, 20 years in some cases. before the trees that do start to regrow, if in a best case scenario, start to sequester more carbon that is still being lost. And of course, we're talking about climate change, where what we don't have is time. And we're talking about goals that need to be hit in the next 7 years in order to avoid really catastrophic consequences. The fact that we're sort of banking on these forests eventually regrowing, 80, 90 years down the road, that's just not going to cut it.
Jennifer Skeen, the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development, wrote that the 2 Billion Trees program is not expected to achieve anticipated reductions, even if fully implemented. And perhaps most interestingly or most problematically, the industry always says, "Oh, we replant." But we never know what happens to those plantations down the road, whether or not they actually succeed, and how much carbon they end up storing. And the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development is saying that post-planting monitoring is insufficient, or simply there's not sufficient information from the government's accounting to indicate whether there's any monitoring of the success of post-cut plantations. Can you comment on this?
Yes, so there's a number of problems with the reliance on tree planting as this sort of marquee natural climate solution for Canada's forests. Canada's Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development released a report, a series of reports a couple of weeks ago, one of which talked about how Canada is dealing with forest carbon dynamics. And one of the problems, as they pointed out, is with how it's implementing its 2 Billion Trees program, which has been sort of the major talking point for the government in terms of showcasing leadership on natural climate solutions. And as that report noted, when it comes to the climate benefits of this program, they are a fraction of what is being emitted on an annual basis by industrial logging. And they're also not even really supposed to realize their full benefit, of course, for several decades, because we're talking about trees that need time to regrow. And study after study, multiple studies have shown that is not the case. I mean, one, of course, the forest, once a primary forest is cut down, it does not recover the same. It is never the same again, at least not on any meaningful human time frame.
It doesn't end up storing as much carbon as the original intact forest.
That's right. So primary forests store, between 30 to 50% more. Some studies have shown more carbon than previously disturbed forests. It, of course, also has unique ecosystem dynamics. Species like boreal caribou rely on these primary forest areas, and you cannot recapture that through replanting. And of course, also when we're talking about shorter timescales, that is also a significant concern. And the problem of monitoring, so in addition to the fact that the forest isn't really recoverable, studies like that done by Wildlands League a couple of years ago showed that there are actually vast areas of forest that are simply failing to regrow even 20 to 30 years later. They termed them logging scars, areas where logging roads or landings and slash piles have suppressed regrowth. And that accounts for about 14% of the impacted forest over the study area that they looked at in northwestern Ontario. And the practices done there are pretty ubiquitous across Canada. So there's no reason to think that it would be significantly different elsewhere.
So the industry is taking out huge swaths of timber, of trees are coming out, and replanting is certainly not as successful as the industry claims. And these failed patches of forest or just open expanses of soil are releasing carbon. Meanwhile, there's an increase in forest fires across the boreal region.
Yeah, there has been a large increase in the number and scale of wildfires, and 2021 was a particularly ravaging year in terms of emissions. And in Canada's inventory, it's indicated that there are about 280 million tons of emissions associated with stand replacing wildfires in 2021. So if you sort of think about that in relation to Canada's reported emissions, it's getting up to almost half of what Canada reports as anthropogenic emissions. And so there are two kind of issues related to that. One is how should countries consider wildfire emissions? To some extent, they're natural processes. There are always wildfires, but we know that climate change is exacerbating wildfires by drying the air and drying the soil and the forests and making them more at risk of wildfire. So a bunch of countries with large forests in the developed world actually count all emissions from wildfires in their country totals of greenhouse gas emissions. And then they also count, regrowth, carbon that's sequestered by regrowth after those wildfires. But Canada and Australia do things a little bit differently. They try and disaggregate or separate out the emissions from wildfires from anthropogenic human-caused emissions. So they consider wildfires to be natural, which, we could have a discussion about that. I think there are some concerns about doing that, given that human-caused climate change is exacerbating wildfires. But the really problematic thing that Canada is doing, which other countries don't do, is not counting emissions from wildfires, but then taking credit for carbon sequestration that occurs naturally by trees regrowing after those wildfires once those trees reach a commercial age. By claiming this massive sink, they're masking the fact that logging is a high emitting sector, and they're portraying the logging sector as being carbon neutral, which, as Jennifer has mentioned, leads to all sorts of perverse policy decisions that put at risk Canada's climate and nature goals.
Well, David, one other dynamic to all of this is you mentioned that there's a reasonable argument that because of climate change, wildfires, or at least some wildfires, should be counted towards anthropogenic emissions. And there is a reasonable argument for that. But further contributing to the egregiousness of completely excluding wildfires is the fact that industrial logging and clear cutting of these forests actually makes them more susceptible to natural disturbances and less resilient to them. So it makes them more prone to more frequent and more intensive wildfires. So the logging industry, again, often presents itself as sort of the savior of the forest from these wildfires. But what's actually happening on the ground is the impacts to these forests are exacerbating them. And then, of course, as Michael mentioned, the inventory, once a stand has burned, all of those emissions are sort of taken off the books. So what Canada is doing is not only giving itself credit for forests it's not cutting, but it's actually completely writing off any emissions that are due to wildfires that basically are caused by the reduced resilience and increased susceptibility of the forest to those stand replacing wildfires.
How do jurisdictions in Europe and the United States place pressure on the forest industry? How do you compare these practices, policies and practices in Europe and in the United States, and investor practices, shareholder practices, with what's going on in Canada?
That's a really great question. And as you note, I mean, we have seen quite a sea change in the last couple of years in terms of both policymaker and marketplace recognition of the impacts on forests and the need to be addressing forest degradation right alongside deforestation. For listeners who may not know sort of the nuances of international parlance, deforestation is sort of the term that's most widely known, but actually it's pretty narrowly defined to only apply when a forest is completely converted to another use entirely. So a forest is cut down and turned into a palm oil plantation or to a cattle ranch. Of course, the argument in Canada is, well, we cut down these forests, but they stay forests, even though, you'd be standing in the middle of the clear cut and there's, not a tree in sight. That is still deemed a forest. That would not actually be considered deforestation. And that's been the basis of Canada's claim that it has near zero deforestation. And so the EU has really taken a particularly strong leadership stance on this, passing fairly recently a new trade regulation that restricts trade that is tied to deforestation and forest degradation. So really setting a bar that will require Canada to take a very close look at its practices. And similarly in the US and internationally, the marketplace is taking an increasingly close look at how forest products are being sourced. In the US back in 2020, 67% of Procter & Gamble shareholders actually voted in favor of a resolution calling on the company to report on what it can do to address deforestation and forest degradation. And a similar percentage of Home Depot shareholders voted for a nearly identical resolution just last May. Enough is enough and time to make a change.
Jennifer Skeen is the Natural Climate Solutions Policy Manager for the Natural Resources Defense Council's Canada program. Michael Polanyi is Policy and Campaign Manager for Nature-Based Climate Solutions at Nature Canada. We'll link to their recent article in Canada's National Observer. That's it for today's GPM, coming to you from Earth Chronicle Productions, Breda, in the Netherlands. Listen, read, and watch more Earth stories at greenplanetmonitor.net. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and YouTube, and our own home base, Blueberry. Wherever you're listening, reading, or watching, please help us make the GPM happen. Subscribe and or donate at greenplanetmonitor.net. Shout out to CFMU listeners in Hamilton, Ontario, and CKUW fans in Winnipeg, Manitoba. By the way, the guy behind this guitar is Dan Weisenberger. Thanks for your brilliant instrumental themes, Dan. I'm David Kattenberg. Over and out for now.